I remember the terror, the confusion, chaos.
We look the same as the enemy. There's no way to fight that kind of thing.
They took away many of the men because they were not citizens, but Japanese could not become citizens.
What would you sacrifice in the name of national security? Would you sacrifice your neighbor's freedom, your own freedom? Would you forsake the rights and responsibilities that define American democracy? Under the leadership of President Roosevelt and General John L. DeWitt, the United States government deems Japanese Americans a threat and imprisons them on U.S. soil, all in the name of the responsibility to provide national security. It is the U.S. government's responsibility to protect and uphold the rights and freedoms in the Constitution. In the 1800s, Asian immigrants came to the U.S. seeking opportunities. Labor leaders opposed Chinese and Japanese immigration, leading to the 1913 Alien Land Law, preventing Asian immigrants from being able to buy land. The Gentlemen's Agreement allowed limited Japanese immigration. While first-generation Japanese immigrants couldn't become citizens, their children born in the U.S. were automatically citizens. In 1941, the Munson Report was issued to the President of the United States and concluded there was no threat from the Japanese immigrants on the West Coast. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. On February 23, 1942, a Japanese submarine attacked an oil field in Goleta. Panic spread with false rumors of aircraft invasions and attacks, including an enemy aircraft shot down by the Army. General John L. DeWitt, columnist Henry McLemore, and 59% of the American public are some of those who supported the forced relocation and incarceration of all people of Japanese descent, whether they were American citizens or not. General John L. DeWitt declared Japanese immigrants' farmland near key infrastructure suggested enemy collaboration and recommended,
"I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast."
Henry McLemore argued that California was the most logical invasion point and said,
"I hate the Japanese," and that goes for all of them.
When the public was surveyed in a poll in 1942, 59% supported the internment because the attack on Pearl Harbor created fear that Japanese Americans could be spies, and many Americans accepted government decisions under the belief that sacrifices, including others' rights, were necessary for victory. President Roosevelt declared,
"Very many American lives have been lost. As Commander-in-Chief, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense."
Japanese Americans became the scapegoats for perceived national security threats. On February 19, 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, giving the military the power to set curfews and strip rights from people of Japanese ancestry, including the right to a fair trial when being accused and arrested, the right to not have their property searched or taken away without a warrant, the right to equal protection under the law, and the right to not be deprived of liberty and property without due process of law. Supreme Court cases like Korematsu v. U.S., Hirabayashi v. U.S., and Yasui v. U.S. reaffirmed non-citizens also have constitutional protections by arguing the government violated rights of due process and equal protection. DeWitt encouraged Japanese Americans and immigrants to voluntarily evacuate, but only 7% did so. In response, DeWitt issued Proclamation No. 4, which banned resident aliens from exclusion zones and forced people of Japanese ancestry to relocate to internment camps. Dr. Watanabe points out,
Americans didn't view Japanese Americans as U.S. citizens. The government never referred to these people as U.S. citizens. They always referred to them as non-aliens because they were afraid that if they used the word citizen in the public, somebody might ask, "Don't citizens have rights?" The government was choosing to ignore those rights.
Attorney General Francis Biddle stated the Department of Justice had no authority to evacuate American citizens of Japanese descent. The Bainbridge Island Review warned of a hysterical hatred towards Japanese Americans. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover argued those posing a security threat had already been identified and arrested. The mass relocation proceeded under the justification of military necessity and responsibility to provide national security. Notices were posted instructing all persons of Japanese ancestry to bring only what they could carry and evacuate. Some people were only given 2 to 3 days to prepare and were subjected to seizures and searches. Families had to sell their property and businesses for next to nothing or risk it being confiscated. No information on where families were being sent to or how long they would be there was given. The exclusion area was drawn up on a map, and to the east of the exclusion line would be 10 relocation camps. Over 120,000 people were incarcerated in these internment camps. While waiting for the camps to be built, people of Japanese ancestry were sent to racetracks and fairgrounds. The government described the internment as
a voluntary migration. It's in no sense a concentration camp.
Hikoji Takeuchi refutes this by saying,
"We were told we are being evacuated so the government can protect us. And they had armament, not facing out, but facing in."
Soldiers enforced strict rules, and anyone attempting to leave could be shot.
All of a sudden, I see this guy here lowering his rifle and aiming at me, and I better go off. When I started picking myself up, then that's when I realized I was shot.
The internment completely changed society and everyday life for those who were interned, who were stripped of their rights, property, freedom, privacy, and human dignity. I interviewed Tamakota, who had shared her experience with me. She was only 17 years old when she heard the news of the evacuation order. Her parents were stoic, but she was bitter and sad. She worried about whether or not she would ever see her home and dog again, and found out later that her dog died after they left. She said she was housed in a horse stable and the stench of manure was awful. Tama and her family were then sent to Topaz, which she described as a camp in the middle of the desert in Utah. The weather was terribly hot or extremely cold, and the dust frequently swirled inside and outside the hastily built barrack. Tama recounted the one suitcase she was allowed to bring did not have clothes adequate for the weather in Topaz. The political impacts of the internment was revoked rights, new laws, and everyone interned at the camps were accused and imprisoned without any trial. Fred Korematsu, Minoru Yasui, and Gordon Hirabayashi resisted internment, were imprisoned and convicted in federal court, then sent to the internment camps. Yasui, an attorney and U.S. Army officer, was told by the judge the curfew order was unconstitutional as applied to citizens, but that he was no longer a citizen with rights because he worked as a consulate general of Japan in Chicago. The American Civil Liberties Union also openly opposed the internment and helped to fund both Korematsu and Hirabayashi's cases. Japanese Americans lost their businesses and jobs despite having training and degrees, and had to take any labor jobs given in the camps by the government for minimum wages. About 4,000 Japanese American men and women felt a responsibility to prove their loyalty by fighting in the war. The 100th Infantry Battalion was an all-Japanese American unit. They joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt acknowledged that Japanese Americans could no longer be deprived of their rights. Mitsui Endo challenged the incarceration, and the Supreme Court ruled in her favor. On January 2, 1945, the exclusion order was lifted and everyone could leave the camps, but found they had no home left to go to. Japanese Americans and their families were forced to start over with limited job opportunities, discrimination, and housing shortages. Some elderly men, unable to face the future, committed suicide. The trauma of humiliation, anger, and alienation continue to affect the mental health of those interned, as well as their future generations. Many faced financial instability and long-term economic struggles, creating a significant barrier to rebuilding their lives. In response, Japanese Americans became champions for civil rights. They formed the Japanese American Citizens League to fight for the government to acknowledge it failed its responsibility to protect rights and prevent similar injustices from happening to anyone else. 43 years later, President Ronald Reagan issued a formal apology to the remaining 60,000 Japanese Americans and signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. President Reagan stated,
"More than 40 years ago, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps, without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race.
The president knew he had a responsibility to acknowledge the injustice of the internment and the violation of their rights. There are clear connections between the government's use of power in wartime and the peacetime use of power today, with mass deportations and immigration enforcement. While the government does have the right to remove non-citizens, it can't do this without due process. Takei responds,
He's not learned the lesson of the internment of Japanese Americans. We must never do that again.
The lessons of Japanese internment matter today. The U.S. government and every U.S. citizen has a responsibility to protect and uphold the rights of all people, no matter where they come from.